Yeah, on, bro. There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the SA. My gosh. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west. The whole thing, dude. That's not our LNS though, is it? It's not. That is an LNS, dude. Well, if there's like... Look at this thing! It's rotating.
We're joined today by Ross Coulthart, an Australian investigative journalist who's won about everything there is to win under the Antipodean sky. Ross' most recent book about unidentified aerial phenomenon, In Plain Sight, comes on the heels of a career that's already earned him 5 Walkley Awards and a Logie. He hosts the podcast Need to Know with Bryce Zabel. Ross Coulthart, welcome to the show.
G'day, gentlemen. Hello from down under.
It's a pleasure to have you here. You've had a long career as an investigative journalist. Your book, In Plain Sight, refers to an aggressive paranoia from the audience and participants in the field of UAP research. Can you tell us about the kinds of intense feedback you've received working on other stories?
I mean, I think the thing that distinguishes the subject of UAPs is hyperskepticism. And
Sure.
I think journalists have a responsibility to be skeptical about any stories, especially stories that make extraordinary claims. But, generally in journalism, you do get pushback on some stories. I mean, I've been interested, for example, over the years in doing stories that looked at the modelling for climate science, for example, and the claims about anthropogenic global warming, which I don't dispute, by the way. What I was fascinated, though, by was the fact that when I talked to people who work on these mathematical models, including people whose names appeared in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they were agonised by the fact that they'd been said to be part of a general consensus about the rates of global warming, but they were concerned that basically for political purposes they'd been zealously lumped in with a group of concerned scientists known as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, whereas in fact they didn't agree with the rates of warming caused by global warming caused by human input. And it interested me as a journalist because it's such a taboo area to even traverse. You know, you get stomped on in the media and called a denialist if you dare to question global warming science. And it's a worry because, frankly, there are taboo areas in journalism that are becoming increasingly no-go areas. And it's the same with UAPs. I mean, for much of my career, I've worked in journalism now for nearly 40 years. And for much of my career, there's been a stigma and a taboo attached and a ridicule attached to the subject of UFOs. In fact, you've only got to mention the subject in a newsroom and an ironic smile creeps across the face of the editor and people start giggling. And it's the subject of ribald reposts. But the reality is it's real, as the United States government is now admitting. And there is a phenomenon that it has acknowledged is a mystery, which many of the commentators assert and the experts assert is intelligently controlled. It appears to be a technology. It's displaying technological characteristics far beyond our science, our known science. And I think it's a legitimate area for journalistic investigation. But yeah, I still cop the odd bollocksing, as we call it in Australia, from some journo who sort of sniggers into his typewriter and basically asserts that, Coulthart's obsessed with UFOs. But I think this is probably one of the most important stories of our era. I'm fascinated as a journalist by the fact that we've allowed ourselves in the mainstream media to be deceived. I'm in absolutely no doubt about this, having spoken now to innumerable sources inside the defence intelligence establishments in different Western nations and indeed in Russia. I think that there has been a decision made to suppress the issue, to sit on it, and to not talk publicly about the fact that there is a very genuine mystery here that that the best in our Air Force, the best in our science cannot explain. And I think the acknowledgements by the United States government to the Congress in the UAP Task Force report, the acknowledgements that have been made by commentators like, for example, Christopher Mellon, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence, these are people who are heavy hitters, who have been cleared inside the defence and intelligence hierarchy. They're saying this is real. And I've got people in my own government who, it's interesting, our Chief of Air Staff, Mel Hupfeld, really nice guy, he's a former combat pilot in the Middle East. He runs our Air Force, and he gave evidence to a parliamentary committee a few weeks before Christmas, where he poured cold water on the idea that Australia would be taking the issue of UAPs seriously. And the irony is I'm talking to people from within his Defence Department who are telling me that Five Eyes intelligence is coming in from the Five Eyes partners, including the United States, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, all the time, with anomalous phenomena, which is detected not only on video, but also on phased array radar systems, on different telemetry tracking systems that are operating in orbit. There is a genuine mystery here that people privately acknowledge. And I'm fascinated by that cognitive dissonance, the fact that we have no national debate either in the US, really, or in Australia, or in the UK, and yet each country has in its own archives records that privately admit the phenomenon is real. And I as a journalist who's trained to question things and to assess data, I think there's a story there, and I'm going to keep on digging.
We're at a moment of transition in the landscape of investigative journalism. I think we've seen a lot of mainstream outlets, particularly here in the United States, as low down as the local level and as far up as the national level, take steps to move away from that type of in-depth reporting. What's your opinion of the role of independent media in the future of investigative journalism broadly, but also maybe particularly in regards to UAP?
Let me just say, I think all journalism should be investigative. I've never liked that distinction between journalism and investigative journalism because by definition, if you're given a press release, I was always taught by my political correspondent boss, a lovely man called Dennis, to go to the final paragraph of the press release and then work backwards, because that's where they generally hid stuff. And you know, essentially, if you were a politician, you'd generally try and plant something in a press release on a Friday afternoon around about 5 o'clock when all the journos are heading off to the hotel for a drink. And you'd try and get all the bad news out on a Friday. So I was always taught to be very skeptical and to question. And I think all journalism, by definition, should be investigating. It shouldn't just accept information on its face. And the big criticism, I've worked in mainstream newspapers, TV for much of the last 35 years. And the thing that I'm shocked by is the way that there is increasingly a tendency in mainstream media to glibly accept what they're spoon-fed. Mm-hmm. And this is what the media's done with UAPs. For years, they've been told by their sources in the CIA, in our intelligence services here in Australia, and people in the Defence Department, this is all rubbish. You know, go away and have a look at a real story. You know, you're going to get ridiculed if you look at the subject of UAPs. There's been a very deliberate policy of trying to turn down interest in the phenomenon. And if you look at the context of what's happening in mainstream media at the moment, I'm fascinated by the debate at the moment that's going on with poor old Joe Rogan. I don't agree with Joe on everything, but I don't think his platform is any less or more distorting than a lot of the crap that floats out on mainstream media in the United States right now. I mean, the reality is there is this unctuous holier-than-thou attitude in a lot of the mainstream media that it is the assessor of objective journalism, and that there's these independent journalists, of which I'm now one. I work in a relationship with an Australian TV broadcaster and a newspaper and file stories when I want to, but I guess I'm an independent journalist. And I don't buy the idea that there should be a distinction between independent journalism and mainstream journalism. Journalism, by definition, is all about rocking the boat, questioning, digging. Don't accept things on their face. Be skeptical. Be contrarian. When somebody tells you something's a fact, ask why. And the interesting thing to me is that the American media is not doing that enough. In your country, your country it led us in Australia and the United Kingdom into war on the false pretext that Saddam Hussein had dangerous weapons of mass destruction. The intelligence service allowed itself to be deluded by nutters who basically wanted to go to war in the Middle East. And as a result, I think there was a confirmation bias where they convinced themselves that this was real. And I think one of the things that underlines is a chronic failure in the media to do its bloody job. One of the things that always amuses me is people in UFO Twitter, the social mad world of social media UFO world.
Yep.
They're all desperate for validation from the mainstream media. And when, say, Bill Whitaker on CBS 60 Minutes does a story on CBS 60 Minutes back in, I think it was June, July last year, everybody wets themselves and goes, oh my God, CBS has acknowledged us, it's real. And the reality is, frankly, it wasn't a great groundbreaking story. It didn't say that much. It wasn't very new. Right. It was a non-revelatory piece of journalism done by a news magazine television program that, frankly, has seen better days. I mean, I worked for the Australian equivalent of that program, and the problem they have, despite the good intentions of the people that run them and people who work for them, is they're increasingly operating on a lower advertising budget. I mentioned Joe Rogan. He's probably got, the average daily newspaper in Australia now is lucky if it gets 70 to 100,000 subscriber viewers. And that's nothing. You're probably getting 100,000 views on your podcast. The reality is, mainstream media has a disproportionate relevance in the minds of commentators and people who are desperate for acclamation, desperate for validation. Frankly, I don't think most people in America give a flying toot about mainstream media anymore. It's made itself irrelevant. And the thing I'm fascinated by, I'm a complete addict of podcasts, social media, Twitter, for example. I think it's fabulous that there's a lot of young people, particularly, generating really interesting content online in defiance of mainstream media. They're filling a need that the mainstream media is failing to fill. And I have a real bee in my bonnet that the moment that the United States Congress was told by the Pentagon in June 25th last year that UAPs are real, and we, the US Air Force and the Defense Department, have basically been bullshitting to you for the last 70 years. If I was an editor of a major newspaper, I would be assigning a full-time rounds person, a person devoted to covering the subject of UAPs, because it's such an amazing area for investigation. I'm mind blown at the moment by the volume of really good people who are getting in touch with me, often through encrypted apps and through my Proton Mail encrypted email, who are basically passing on to me information that they've been sitting on for years, and they've been waiting for somebody that they perceive has got mainstream media training, but who's willing to engage with this issue, because there's been a gag, there's been a self-imposed gag on coverage of the phenomenon that makes no good sense. And I think, frankly, the story of UAPs is the story of one of the biggest failures of so-called mainstream media to do its job in the past 75 years. They allowed themselves to be snowed.
And to now really dig in on the issue would in part be to acknowledge that shortcoming and that failure?
Well, I think they're going to have to. I mean, it's funny. I work for an organisation called ICIJ, which is the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and we do collaborative investigations on things like big tobacco and the Panama Papers. And there's been great successes in getting databases leaked to us, which reveal all sorts of nefarious, disgustingly illegal, naughty goings on by different people in governments and positions of influence all over the world. And I've been getting calls and emails from journalist friends of mine in big mainstream media outfits in the US, Italy, Spain, France, the UK, Denmark, Sweden, and they're basically concerned that their radar didn't pick up this issue. And it's interesting because I'd say probably 50-60% of the people that have contacted me have told me that they're aware of interesting stories that they've basically sat on and not done because they were worried about the stigma. And there was a Spanish guy the other day telling me about an incredible incident at an Air Force base that he's got documentation for, and he'd held back publishing what he knew for the simple fact that the subject matter is very, very hard to put before an editor of a major newspaper and get a run on. Because I don't think these editors are being told by dark men in black, you shall not run this story. It's as simple as, you're a bloody idiot if you run this story. There's this attitude that has pervaded now for much of the last, probably at least since the 1960s, which is that if you engage with the subject matter of UAPs, you're inviting yourself to get caught up with a crazy bunch of tinfoil hat loonies, and you're basically going to cop a ridiculing in the media. And it's interesting because that used to be a legitimate thing to do, but now, and I say this repeatedly to people, and my journalist friends are actually picking up on this, the Pentagon is very slowly, the military from the most powerful government in the world is admitting this is real. It has put a report before the Congress where it said it cannot explain 143 out of 144 anomalous objects that were detected on different sensor systems, not only by the US Navy, but by private commercial pilots, private citizens. And this data has been assessed by the Pentagon's investigators, and they can't come up with a prosaic, a mundane, everyday explanation for what this is. And if you roll back another 25 years ago to the United Kingdom, what's really interesting is the United Kingdom, in a report called the Condign Report, CONDIGN, it did an identical report where it talked about the fact that it couldn't explain phenomena. And the report was only declassified because of the noble efforts of a Dr. David Clarke, who's a journalist and author in the United Kingdom. And basically the British Defence Department was begrudgingly forced to admit that, yes, 25, 30 years ago, it did an investigation into the phenomenon, and it too could not explain it. The French, God bless them, the French, they've long had, through Guépin, an investigation going on into UFOs, UAPs. They've long acknowledged that there's a phenomenon here that they cannot explain. I've spoken to people in France who've told me that they think it's a technology far beyond human hands. It's not of this world. And this was a military official in France. I've had similar conversations with officials who were at very senior levels in the Russian military, who are now taking an advisory role to groups that are advising the Russian government on the same issue. Very, very slowly, there is an awakening happening. And I know a lot of people think that there's been a dastardly cover-up of some incredible secret. And I suspect there's probably a few people who do know the whole story. And I do suspect that your country, the United States, is sitting on recovered non-human technology. I really do. Too many people have said this for it not to be the case. But I think the vast number of people in military and intelligence services around the world who've put the line, oh, these things pose no threat to national security, because this was the line. people would say to the military for years, they'd say, these objects we're seeing in the sky, what are they? Are they real? And the military would never answer the question. It would only ever say, oh, no, these are no threat to national security and they're no threat to flight safety, so stop worrying about it. Go away. It's all rubbish and most of it can be prosaically explained. We now know that was deliberate disinformation. We now know that was untrue. And the big question now is, why have so many governments around the world been pushing a line that is frankly untrue? The journo in me, the journalist in me, takes the default assumption that most governments are incompetent and that the defense of any bureaucrat when confronted with a question they can't answer is to basically feign knowledge and to go, oh, no, we're completely in touch with this issue. Don't worry about it, chaps, go away. We know, no threat to national security, go away. When the reality is they couldn't give such assurances. And I discovered when I went through writing my book in plain sight, I was going through the Australian National Archives, and there was this rich load of defence documents and intelligence documents which showed that, contrary to the public narrative where we were being told, yes, we know what these things are, don't worry, everything's fine, and you're an idiot if you look at it, because frankly there's nothing to it and there's no threat to national security or flight safety. Behind the scenes, especially when we were letting off bombs for the British and testing technology with you guys in the Australian outback, there was huge concern about anomalous objects that were, especially when it involved the potential for a connection with nuclear facilities, nuclear weapons, nuclear power. Something was taking an interest. And there was huge concern in my country, in the United Kingdom, in France, especially in America, at the fact that this was a mystery that couldn't be resolved.
Your book, In Plain Sight, contemplates the differences between a cover-up and bureaucratic confusion or incompetence. Which do you think is the bigger factor here, or do we have a complete split between them?
Okay, I think there is a small cadre. I'm persuaded now by my sources that I've spoken to. I've spoken to too many people now for it to not be the case. I've spoken to people who purport to either be or have been part of what's colloquially referred to inside the group as the program. And the allegation is that the United States has recovered technology. I mean, Christopher Mellon, no less, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, has indicated very strongly that there's something to this. Lou Elizondo, the former head of the Pentagon program, who was one of the most, people don't realize, he's one of the most highly cleared people. One of his previous roles in the Defense Department had him working with the SAPOC, the Special Access Program Oversight Committee, and he was given access to review every single special access program, which is the term you guys in America use for the dark secrets that you want to keep from prying eyes. And he was also privy to the waived, unacknowledged special access programs, the WUSAPs, the biggest secrets of all. And the interesting thing about it is these people are saying, this is real. They're saying there is technology. They're saying that they are persuaded that the United States is in possession of technology that is possibly not of human hands. And increasingly, they're getting more and more brazen in their assertions. They're using words like craft, vehicle. They're talking about intelligently crafted technology. I've had similar conversations with people in other governments around the world, including my own, who frankly admit to me that, yeah, they are suspicious that the United States is not telling all. But the reality is I've also had conversations with people in organizations like your Defense Intelligence Agency, your Central Intelligence Agency, your National Security Agency, your intelligence umbrella, if you like, and they feign not indifference. They've got concern because they're aware it's real. They're telling me there is no doubt this phenomenon is real. But whatever it is, they're not briefed into it. And they're suspicious that there are people in the United States who are briefed into it. And I have a a suspicion that an overzealous bunch of generals, aerospace insiders, intelligence community officials many, many years ago decided to bury this, and that perhaps there's a dark presidential executive order that's never been disclosed, which has allowed this to be kept confidential. It's the only explanation that I can think of, because frankly, knowing what I know, I'm in no doubt that there are people who have concealed something that, frankly, unless there's some very solid national security reason for the American public not to know, that's been legalized with a presidential executive order, crimes have been committed.
Yeah.
People have lied to your Congress. They've lied to oversight agencies like your inspectors general, your various ombudsmen, your auditors general. Crimes have been committed to conceal the expenditure of funds. And it's interesting, I've noted that, for example, Lou Elizondo has been quite open about his concern that there are people who are potentially in breach of the law for concealing what they know.
Yeah.
And I do think a reckoning is coming.
Well, and I think certain private institutions have been given preferential treatment as well, which I think that other forces in the market would be upset about if they were to discover the full extent and detail.
Well, one of the things that's happened to me since I wrote my book is I've been contacted, I can tell you privately, by senior officials of private aerospace companies that aren't getting their share at the lolly jar. And they're interested to know what I know. And they're
Yeah.
suspicious, as I'm suspicious, that certain aerospace companies, by dint of sheer historical happenstance, were given access to material that others weren't.
Yep.
And has that given them an advantage that has not been disclosed to the SEC? Has there been a corporate non-disclosure? And if so, under what legal context has this happened? We're in a really interesting period at the moment in 2022, because as you gentlemen would know, in December, the National Defence Authorization Act basically required quite unprecedented disclosures by the intelligence, defence and aerospace community, essentially revealing by October this year what is known about UAPs. Is there recovered technology? You know, why hasn't the Congress been told about it if that was the case? Now, I don't know necessarily that it hasn't been disclosed to the so-called Gang of Eight, because Senator Harry Reid, before he died, was one of the most long-serving and most influential members of the Gang of Eight. And I think it's very instructive that one of the congressmen, one of the senators given exclusive access to know America's deepest secrets, took an intimate and close interest in the UAP issue. Why did Harry do that? History will one day tell us that.
True.
It's really interesting. I mean, I think that in October this year, the Congress, at least, it may not be publicly released, but the oversight committees of Congress have demanded, and unless military and intelligence officials are going to continue to commit crimes, they will receive data that has never, ever been received. They will receive information that summarizes what the United States knows about UAPs. And the big question is, will that leak? I bloody well hope it does.
I think that oftentimes people are interested in this topic because of kind of a pre-existing fascination. Okay. And I think that oftentimes when you talk to people within the state and the intelligence community, they're interested in this topic because of its influence on geopolitics and the next generation weapons platform. Why should a normal person, for instance, outside of the state, someone who doesn't have a pre-existing fascination with the topic, why should they care?
I think the best way to come into this is to describe what we're talking about. Let's talk about the 5 observables that Lou Elizondo, the head of the Pentagon, it's a term that he's coined to describe what we're talking about here. No, these are universally agreed now. These objects are displaying sudden, instantaneous acceleration. They can literally go from a standing start to, as I understand it, 10,000 miles an hour in the blink of an eye. They are capable of hypersonic velocities, extraordinary speeds, without signatures. They're not leaving a trail, they're not leaving an IR, an infrared heat trail. They're not showing the kind of disruption that you would expect to be caused by displacement of such a large object through an atmosphere. You don't even get a wind. They're low observability. They have a stealth capacity. They've been known to be able to literally blip themselves off radar. They are also, and this is where it gets really spooky, they're capable of trans-medium travel. They've been recorded in orbit. They've been recorded traveling from orbit into our atmosphere, and they've also been recorded underwater, moving from air into water. Without the kind of displacement that you would expect, the kind of explosion that you would expect if an object hit water at such speed. And they're displaying, I think it's used, the term that's used is positive lift, but essentially it's an anti-gravity. So this is a technology that is displaying science far beyond known human science. And despite what the debunkers and the skeptics say, we've got this weird thing at the moment where certain experts are still trying to prove that the gimbal UFO was just an artifact caused by a rotating gimbal on an AT-FLIR imaging system. And they're pulling their hair out, desperately trying to prove it. And all the AT-FLIR experts are saying it's bollocks. But the reality is the Pentagon's UFO investigation team have looked at every possible prosaic explanation. They have only publicly commented on incidents involving the USS Nimitz and the USS Theodore Roosevelt, and a few very isolated incidents that involved aircraft off the east coast of the United States in the period up to the publicity of the report in June 2021. But I'm told by my own sources, and indeed in some cases by direct eyewitnesses, that these incidents are still occurring. There are daily confrontations between pilots and fighter jets going up off the east coast where they are engaging with objects that are displaying these 5 observables characteristics, a technology that, as far as we know, is not ours. It's not Russian, it's not Chinese, and unless there's some kind of Thunderbirds agency on a Pacific island somewhere that's developed all of this technology, or a private aerospace company that's doing this in secret, there's a big question mark here. Even Avril Haines, your director of national intelligence, your national intelligence czar, has used the word extraterrestrially. Perhaps the word extraterrestrial might explain this phenomenon. That's just unprecedented. You've had former directors of the CIA, another former DNI, John Ratcliffe, former presidents, all dropping hints that this might just be non-human intelligent life. Now, I'm not saying it's little green men or little pink men or whatever, but the interesting thing is it's real. So that's why people should be interested in this. This is possibly one of the biggest questions that we ask ourselves. Are we alone? And what happens to us after we die? They're the 2 big questions. That's why it matters.
The premise here that this is the biggest mystery maybe in the world, it should be enough to interest anyone. I absolutely, I think that's a great answer. However, I wonder, when you consider the implications of the 5 observables, can this next generation of technology ever be used to change the material premise of human life on Earth?
Well, that's the interesting question, because there are, of course, the conspiracy theorists who assert that the United States, and I'm not necessarily a subscriber to this belief, I just don't know, but the conspiracy theory has it that the United States long ago cracked the skills that allow them to understand positive lift, anti-gravity, or to derive free energy from the 0 point. I just don't know if that's true or not. I've got people who say that to me, but I just frankly won't believe it until I'm kicking the tires of the flying saucer in a cave in Area 51, frankly. It's just so preposterous.
Mm-hmm.
But what this technology potentially represents isn't just something that could change the world technologically. It could send you and me to the stars. Sadly, it's also a potential weapon. And the way it's been explained to me by some people who purport to know is that if people knew and understood the simplicity of the technology that allegedly can be revealed if this was disclosed, it would allow every terrorist group and every extremist on the planet to basically destroy a large, if not all, the human population in the blink of an eye. It's formidably powerful technology. And frankly, even if you don't accept the conspiracy theory, if you just accept that, yes, there is a reality which is still unexplained, I've heard it described by some wonderful scientists from the SCUAP, the Scientific Coalition for the Study of UAPs, Robert Powell. I think he was talking about the energy that would be required to do what one object was seen to do, which was to move from somewhere above or at 80,000 feet to hovering above the surface of the ocean in 0.78 of a second. And the energy consumed that he estimated was necessary to be consumed to do that kind of maneuver was more than the United States generates in 1 year. A phenomenal amount of energy.
Yeah.
And, the reality is I'm vexed at the moment because there are people that I've spoken to in your government who've acknowledged privately to me that their personal view is that it's real, that yes, the United States is aware of this technology, but that it's concerned about what its emancipation into human knowledge might mean.
Yeah.
And the view is that we're not ready for it, that we can't be trusted with technology like this. And I've been told some really wacky things. There are claims that if you look at the megalithic ruins around this planet, some of these ruins indubitably have to be the ruins of previous civilizations, that they cannot plausibly be explained as human ruins from current human civilization. I don't know enough about it, frankly, to know one way or the other, but some of these megalithic ruins go back possibly 10, 20,000 years, and yet they show rock cutting. They show a level of accuracy in terms of an understanding of astronomy that is phenomenal. I was reading something last night about a Sumerian tablet that is over 3,000 years old, and it was essentially recently translated, and it was a calculus equation describing the motion of Jupiter. Now, how in hell did the Sumerians, one, understand calculus, and two, understand the motions of Jupiter? I mean, these are mysteries that we don't know. And one of the fascinating things to me is what I know as a journalist is that the CIA, particularly in the 1960s, began an incredible investigation into the megalithic history of the world. And it actually went looking for Atlantis. It looked for megalithic ruins around the planet. And you can download these files from the CIA's archives. I think there are people in your government and mine and other governments around the world that have asked themselves this question. If, hypothetically, such a technology did exist, and I certainly know it exists, we know prima facie it exists because it's been recorded, it's been seen. The 5 observables have been observed, and the implications of the 5 observables are that someone, something, some entity is basically displaying a technology that currently, publicly, we do not have. But privately, let's assume for a moment that there is some dark agency of DARPA or the Defense Department or maybe the Department of Energy in your country that's got a working 0-point energy generator or a anti-gravitic platform or a plasma weapon or some kind of particle beam technology, would you publicize that? And I'm not making excuses for the people that have perhaps presided over this hypothetical cover-up, but if I was a military official or the President of the United States, weighed down with the responsibility, possibly 50 or 60 years ago when this discovery was first made, and charged with the responsibility of assessing whether the world was ready for technology like this in the darkest days of the Cold War, when the world, frankly, was on the point of mutually assured destruction, when, we do have weapons that are capable of destroying the planet, hydrogen bombs. We still, to this day, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has the clock, the doomsday clock, closer than at any other point in its history, including the darkest days of the Cold War. So would you want this technology, if it hypothetically existed, to be made available and freely available to every nation around the world? I'm not so sure I would.
I think this is a place that we've ended up talking with other people in this topic before. And so I want to pose you a question that we've posed in the past. I think that to think again about that person who doesn't have an existing fascination with the topic, that they would be aware that, every day we kind of live under the threat of this complete annihilation at the hands of nuclear weapons already. And so I think that it might be likely someone, would hear about this technology and not really see that as such a huge change, as such a huge, maybe an intensification, but not a paradigm shift. I wonder which you see. Is this an intensification of the conditions we live under, or a paradigm shift?
I think it's a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, it's funny, because I have friends and I'll be sitting in a pub and they'll say to me, "Why are you so interested in this UFO subject? Seriously, Roscoe, you're a serious journalist. Why are you looking at this?" And I go, "Well, firstly, because it's true that the United States has admitted it's real. And that's always a flummoxing thing for them because generally they're unaware of that. But what I also think has not happened is I don't think most in the mainstream media and a lot of commentators have actually thought back to the implications of what the Pentagon's admission means. When Dave Fravor, the F-18 captain, engaged with the Tic Tac off the USS Nimitz in 2004, an object that was intelligently controlled, displaying all of the 5 observables, including anti-gravity, hypersonic maneuvers, stealth capacity, transmedium travel. It was intelligently engaging with him. And the Pentagon has admitted that's true. That is a paradigm change that is, frankly, mind-blowing in its implications. It means that someone out there has technology that the world does not yet know about. And if you think about a lot of the problems that are blighting this planet at the moment, I mean, we're on the brink of war in Europe for the first time since World War II. Actually, no, that's not true. There was Bosnia. But essentially, it's the largest potential land war in Europe, basically, since World War II. And a large part of the reason why everybody's so soft about taking on Putin, who's an out-and-out fascist, is because he controls the energy that fuels Europe. You've got this massive natural gas pipeline that's fueling the Germans. They don't want to be cold in wintertime. And so their political resolve about standing up for an ally, Ukraine, that's being threatened by an authoritarian fascist like Putin, is being damaged by the concerns about energy. And a large part of what defines our planet at the moment is concerns about energy. Countries can't fuel their own country without having to cause damage to the environment by releasing dangerous global warming fumes. This could revolutionize the planet. African countries could be lifted out of poverty. And I don't know if I buy into the conspiracy theory that a lot of people believe that the fossil fuel industry is basically part of the dark Illuminati that are presiding over the cover-up, and that it's all about stopping and protecting the fossil fuel industry as long as possible because greedy bastards are making so much money out of oil. I think it's as simple as there is a fear that releasing this technology into the world could have unforeseen consequences that lead to the destruction of this planet. And I don't think it's any coincidence that people that I've spoken to who work in intelligence, multiple people, have told me that they believe that we're not the first civilization on this planet and that we've screwed it up before.
Yep.
And that the evidence suggests that other civilizations wasted themselves. And maybe that's why, if there is a benevolent alien out there, it's taking a patronizing interest in us because it knows, oh God, they're about to do it again, you know.
Yeah. Ross, I'm curious. So we kind of have talked a little bit about this with Frank Milburn. But have you encountered in any of your sources, I guess, information that might suggest that Russia and China might also have some form of exotic wreckage?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
You know, we've talked with Frank a little bit about like the potential sort of kidnapping threat that some of these scientists in the U.S. have that are working on some of these programs. So I was kind of curious if you had encountered that at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I've talked to Frank about that and I know who he's talking about. And it really is, it's quite concerning because there's a very active espionage program and very little counterintelligence against it that's been ongoing mainly by China, but also by Russia in places like Huntsville, Alabama, where a lot of this research is going on. In terms of recovered material, well, I mean, frankly, I'm only ever as good as my sources, but my sources tell me that the Russians in particular have recovered craft and that they're as vexed as we are in terms of trying to back engineer it. I was told by one source that there is a facility in the Ural Mountains, which of course is where in every James Bond movie you would put such a facility, which is working on back engineering this technology. And there are stories that the Chinese, I'm not persuaded that the Chinese have recovered technology, but I'm certainly aware that they're mounting an incredible offensive program, not only to procure the secrets of every aspect of your aerospace technology, but they're also mounting an incredibly aggressive program to find out what research is being done into anti-gravitics in your country. And there's very active research into anti-gravitics going on in the United States as we speak. Frank and I, it's interesting, we were laughing the other day with each other about the fact that independently of each other and through separate sources, we've confirmed pretty much the same thing, that, you know, we're in no doubt that there is recovered technology. And every now and then I sort of sit there and shake my head because it's one of the biggest conspiracy theories that's been around for much of the last 30 or 40 years that's been generally mocked and ridiculed by a lot of mainstream media. But can I just point you guys to the fact that in July 2020, one of the world's greatest newspapers, the New York Times, ran a story where it suggested that the United States was in possession of recovered alien technology. Yeah. And they buried it in an article that was the weirdest article. It was one of the Leslie Kane, Ralph Blumenthal, Helene Cooper pieces. And it had a piece by Senator Harry Reid, and in the original quotes, which I'm sure they would have run by Harry Reid before he said them, Harry Reid was quite declaratory that he was of the belief that the United States had recovered non-human technology. And then the following day, they had to do an apology or a correction where Harry Reid was allowed to say that he suspected that the United States had recovered non-human technology. Yep. And I got the feeling that Harry had been stomped on from his role in the Gang of Eight. You know, they'd come to him and they'd said, "Hey, Senator, or former Senator, you know, you've just gone a little bit too far there, sir. You need to tell the New York Times to pull its head in." And then you've got wonderful people like Dr. Eric Davis, who's a guy I hugely admire, who's quite fearless. He has said categorically that the United States has recovered craft. And I've basically, myself, in my research, in my book, I came across a guy called Nat Kovitz, who was at the time I interviewed him, the former Director of Science and Technology Development for the entire US Navy, the US Navy's chief geek, if you like, the chief R&D guy. And Nat was was dying, sadly. He's a lovely, lovely, lovely man. And he and I became friendly. And after a few weeks of chatting, he confided in me that he was read into the program and told that the United States had recovered multiple craft, and that there is and was an active back engineering program underway for many years.
Is there any sort of like consensus among your sources in them sort of thinking that, given the number of potential wreckages, craft that have been recovered, that they think it's been done intentionally? For example, that whatever is flying these is leaving them intentionally, given the sheer number of them.
It's funny. I was going back through my notes of a conversation I had with a source who I shall refer to always as the spaceman, and he was one of the closest friends of Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 astronaut and lunar module landing pilot. Edgar told my friend the spaceman that one of the incidents that he was briefed into by people who had direct knowledge of the incident was that a full intact craft was recovered by the US military, and it was across the border in Mexico. It's the Chihuahua incident, and the claim was that essentially a fully functioning craft was recovered, and basically he said that it was like the lights were on, the machine was humming, all the dials were, I'm just making this up, but all the dials were whizzing. But basically the impression was that it had been gifted.
Right. Yeah, that's incredible. If it's real.
Yeah, and look, frankly, I don't know, because that's hearsay, and in my line of work, hearsay is next to useless as evidence.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly, I'm increasingly confident that technology has been recovered, and like you, I'm very skeptical about the idea that a highly intelligent, technologically advanced civilization could be brought down by 20th century weaponry. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, maybe a lightning strike for if the Roswell story is real. But there's a lot of question marks in my mind about claims that, for example, radar had the capacity to bring down by distorting the bubble of the plasma field of the craft. I mean, I frankly don't know. I'm not a physicist. I have no idea. But brighter people than me have suggested that they think there is something to this, that essentially it would appear that some of this technology has been gifted.
Yeah, Russ, we've already had our hour with you, and I really appreciate you giving us a moment of your valuable time, and we look forward to following anything that you do in the future.
Thanks very much.
Michael and I have both been listening to Need to Know. You and Bryce are doing an awesome job. It's good.
Oh, that's very good of you. Well, if people want to know any more about what I'm interested in, they can read my book, In Plain Sight, which hopefully, oh my God, I cannot believe it's not available in the US at the moment because it's sold out. But there's a truckload of books coming your way that should be there by the end of this month. And
Awesome.
I'm assured by HarperCollins it'll be in bookshops before the end of February. But thanks very much for your interest, and I hope your audience enjoyed our chat.
Thank you so much.
Yep, thank you, Ross. This is an independently produced podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at COINTELPROPod and support more of our work on our Patreon page. The link is in the show notes and in our Twitter bio. We'll see you next week on COINTELPRO.